All right, Shabbosai, good morning, good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei, Dr. Linda Weinberg, Sarah and Ricky Gratz, Julia, Rena, and Eve, in loving memory of their husband, father, and Zayda, Dr. Paul Weinberg, Peretz Moshe ben Avram David, in commemoration of his second yard site. To thank Ayal and Sarah Steinberg for dedicating the shiur this month in the schos of Rafu Shlema for Shulamis Bas Susha, and Adam Yudit Ben Zev for dedicating the shiur this month in the schos of our tefillos being Niskabel. Our Day of Learning sponsors, Sarah Rubenstein, in commemoration of the yard site of her husband, Chaim Ben Rav Shmuel Moshe Zichrono Livracha, and our Daf Yomi sponsor, Michael Judelson, in commemoration of the yard site of his mother, Edith Judelson Zichrono Livracha. We hope to have the merit of our brachos of our Talmud Torah, in the Meretz Hashem and Hashem Shtav and Aliyah, and the families Ein Nechama. So with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. Baruch Hashem, today's daf is Kuf Zayin 107. And we are picking up on Kuf Vav Amud Beis 106b. We are picking up with Tanoihi 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 21 lines up from the bottom. So Gemara says Tanoihi. So let's remember again, we left off, I kind of read through quickly those last couple of lines in the Gemara, the last brisa there. So remember again, the Gemara was actually talking about a very interesting discussion, which began on the top line of Kuf Vav Amud Beis 106b, namely, which fund do our Kli Sharis come from? Remember again, Kli Sharis, specifically the Gemara is talking about over here, are service utensils used to help with the karbanos offered up on the outer Mizbeach. Which fund do those, where does the money come from for those particular utensils? Is this a Bedek Habayis issue? Does this ultimately come from what we'll call temple upkeep and repairs? Because since the outer Mizbeach is a solid structure, therefore anything associated with it ultimately, again, comes from Bedek Habayis, or is it considered to be carbonic in nature and therefore comes from Machzis HaShekel? So the Gemara just points out over here tonight, it's a Machlokes Tanoim. This nan, because we learned, very interesting, this nan, Mosar Truma, Mahayu Osimba. We'll say the leftover of the Machzis HaShekel. What would they do with it? Literally, what would they do with the leftover Machzis HaShekel coins? So Rikoy Zav Sipoy the base Kodesh HaKadoshim. Very interesting. So they would use it for the gold plating in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. They will say, this is very interesting. If there was leftover money, what they would do is they would try to gold plate the walls and the floor. So again, that wasn't a necessity, but if there was leftover money, that's what they would use it for. Rabbi Shmuel says, Moser Peiros l'keis hamizbeach, Moser Truma l'kli sharis. Rabbi Shmuel says, Moser Peiros, leftover Peiros. Now, we don't know yet what that term means. The Gemara is going to define it in just a little bit. But the leftover from the Peiros goes l'keis hamizbeach. So we've seen this, remember again, back in our Shkalim days. What's keis hamizbeach? The idea was that the mizbeach should never be idle. So therefore, again, there was like a fund, a carbon fund. For some reason, should the mizbeach be idle? Although it would be hard to imagine that the mizbeach in the Beis Hamikdash was ever idle. But again, if for some reason there was a lull in carbonic activity, they would have a fund from which to purchase additional karbanos so that it should never be idle. So the Gemara says most are peiros left over from the peiros fund, which we'll see in just a few moments what that is. The case of Mizbeach goes to these supplemental karbanos. Most are truma left over machzes hashakel likli sharis. So we'll say this is the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel. So Rabbi Shmuel holds that halacha lemaisa klei sharis, service utensils for the outer Mizbeach, comes from the leftover machzis hashakel. Okay, Rabbi Akiva disagrees. He says, Moser Trum lekeis hamizbeach, leftover machzis hashakel ultimately goes to the keis hamizbeach, ultimately goes to this carbonic fund, supplemental carbonic fund. Moser nesachim, leftover nesachim. I will say, so this was actually in yesterday's daf. I didn't get a chance to read this Rashi. Rashi explains that Moser nesachim refers to money that the Beis Hamikdash would make as a result of locking in certain contracts for produce. So often they were able to lock in money, they were able to lock in contracts at lower prices, so therefore there was often surplus funds. Either that, or when the Beis Hamikdash purchased anything, let's say for example like flour, so merchants gave the Beis Hamikdash a little bit of a premium. The premium was in the form that normally when you would buy flour, so the merchant levels off the utensil used for measuring. When the Beis Hamikdash bought, they would heap it. That extra amount, that heap, they would be able to sell, and those monies, those surplus monies, ultimately belong to the Beis Hamikdash. That's called Mosar Nesachim. So left over from the Nesachim, Likli Sharis. So we'll say, Rabbi Akiva holds that Kli Sharis doesn't come from Machzis HaShekel, right? Doesn't come from Trumas Halishka, but rather again comes from this Mosar Nesachim. Rabbi Chanina's Kankonim Omer, Rabbi Chanina's Kankonim says, Mosar Nesachim L'Ketzam Mizbeach. He holds the Mosar Nesachim goes for the Karban fund. Mosar Truma L'Kli Sharis. And leftover Machzis HaShekel goes to Kli Sharis. But neither agreed with Peros. Okay, so we'll say, or neither agreed about the Peros. Tushimar says, by the way, Peros Maihi. What is this Peros case? What are we talking about over here? Visanya Moser Truma Mahayu Osinba. What would they do with the leftover Machzis HaShekel? Lokhin, this is very interesting. What would they do with the leftover Machzis HaShekel? So Lokhin Peros Bizol Umochrim Osam Bioker. So both say, with the leftover Machzis HaShekel, they would buy, this is a good Jewish practice, they would buy it wholesale, right, and resell at retail, right? So in other words, so they would go ahead and they would purchase, and remembering, and I both say, you have to understand, part of doing business with the Beis HaMikdash was always an understanding that the Beis HaMikdash was always going to make a profit. In other words, anyone who contracted business with the Beis HaMikdash was never doing so for profit, they were always doing so for privilege. Interesting, not profit, but for privilege. And therefore, pretty much, you are going to, if not lose out on costs, you at least were going to go ahead and, well, you were going to take a loss. We're going to take a loss. But again, that was part of the privilege of doing business with the Beis HaMikdash. So what does it mean, Peros? Peros means they would buy at a discount and sell at a premium. Vaschar makitzin boas hamizbeach. And ultimately, again, with the profits that they would use for Ketz HaMizbeach, that they would use for the supplemental carbonic fund. V'zoi sheshaninu, this is what we learned. Mosar peros leketz HaMizbeach. Okay, so my zev v'zel hayu modim peros. We'll say, so what does it mean when it said neither of them agreed regarding the peros? Disnan Mosar shiar lishkama hayu osin ba. What would they do with the leftover Machzis HaShekel? Lo kin bahen yenos shmanim v'salsos. They would use the monies to purchase wine, oil, and flour. Vaschar lahektish. They would sell it, and the profit would belong to the Beis HaMikdash. Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva says, no. Ein mistakrim b'shal hektish. We don't start doing business with consecrated funds. Af lo b'shal aniyim. Interestingly enough, we also don't do business with tzedakah funds. B'shal hektish my taima. We'll say, why is it ultimately again that we don't start going ahead and doing business with hektish funds? Ein aniyos b'makom ashirus. Ultimately, again, because there is no poverty. Ultimately, again, in a place of wealth. In other words, we'll say, so that has to do with the fact that we're also not going to use hektish funds for tzedakah, right? Because that to use something that is so consecrated for an impoverished cause, that we won't do. So the Gemara says, why don't we go ahead and do things with the monies of aniyim? Because we'll say we're concerned that let's say the Beis HaMikdash has surplus aniyim funds. We're concerned that even right now, if they don't need it, but if they go ahead and they transact business with it, and right now the monies aren't available, if there comes an ani who requires the funds and the monies aren't available, that will be problematic. Okay, so we'll say, so if you look at Rashi, actually we don't have to get Rashi now. We'll say, so by the way, halacha l'maisa, bottom line, takeaway. So remember, we started with a very specific question, which is, where does the money for Kli Sharis come from? Right? That's our fundamental question. So how do we paskin? So we'll say, so the Rambam paskins like Rabbi Akiva, right? Ultimately, again, telling us that halacha l'maisa, Kli Sharis does not come from Machzis HaShekel. Instead, leftover Machzis HaShekel was used for Ketz HaMizbeach, was used for that supplemental carbonic fund, which meant, again, should there be a lull in carbonic activity, you would go ahead and purchase supplemental carbonos from that fund. Where did Kli Sharis come from? So Mosar Nesachim. Ultimately, again, the Rambam passes like Rabbi Akiva, that Kli Sharis came from Moser Nesachim, which again, according to Rashi, let's go with the approach that it comes from the money the Beis Hamikdash made through heaping measures. Right? That remember when you bought for the Beis Hamikdash, you bought with some extra. They sold off the extra, and they were able to make money. That money was used to purchase Kli Sharis. Incredible, good. I will say that was like a total detour in Maseches Kesuvos, but a fascinating and riveting one nevertheless. So what was I? Back to our regularly scheduled program. So remember again, the Mishnah brought up a case of a woman whose husband went overseas. Right, went overseas. And the problem was, he left without leaving her mazonos, or at least she claims he left without leaving her mazonos. Now the shaila is, what happens? Does Beis Din start selling off his property in order to go ahead and sustain his wife? So here we go. Itmar, they both say fundamental machlokes. Rav says, tap of kovzayim, poskim mazonos liisha. So Rav says, if a woman shows up in Beis Din and she says, my husband went overseas and he left me no mazonos, halacha l'maisa, Beis Din starts selling off his property in order to sustain his wife. Look at Rashi, tap Rashi, Kuf Zayin Amud Aleph, 107a. Beis Din yardin l'nichsei mishalach l'dinas hayam, uposkim mizonos l'ishto. So Rav says, halacha l'maisa. Lady shows up in Beis Din. She says, my husband didn't leave me anything. Beis Din begins to sell off property in order to sustain the wife. Shmuel says, ein poskim mizonos l'isha. Leishes ish. Shmuel says, no, we don't do this. We don't do this. So Amar Shmuel, so we'll say, here we go. So Shmuel says, Modili Abba, we'll say Abba over here is Rav. So Shmuel says, Rav will agree with me, Rav agrees with me in the first 3 months that the husband left town. Right? Within the first 3 months the husband left town, halacha l'maisa, even Rav agrees that Beis Din won't sell off property. Why not? Lefi she'in adam maniach beso reikon. I will say this is an interesting idea because we assume, right, people always have food in the cabinets, right? They always have food in the freezer. The idea being that a person doesn't leave his home destitute. In other words, so what Shmuel is saying is even Rav holds that when we say that Beis Din will sell off property in order to sustain the woman, that's if the husband's away for a protracted amount of time. But within the first 3 months of his departure from the home, the assumption is there's food in the home, there's money, there's some money to be spent. There's not an urgency immediately. Not an urgency immediately. So the right. So therefore, I will say that's good. So here's what we have. We have Machlokes Rav and Shmuel, right? Does Beis Din get, if a woman shows up, says my husband went overseas, does Beis Din get involved in selling off property to sustain the wife? Rav, yes. Shmuel, no, but Shmuel saying even Rav agrees that his yes is only after 3 months, but not within the first 3 months. Okay, so here we go. So we'll say, when we hear that the husband died, everyone agrees that what? Everyone agrees that Beis Din will get involved and sell off property. Look at Rashi. So we'll see that's very interesting because Rashi fills in some of the blanks over here. So right, when we hear that the husband died, everyone agrees that Beis Din will get involved and sell off property. Rashi says, the poskin, that Beis Din will get involved and sell off property. Why? Now I will say, let's take a step back for just a moment. What's Shmuel's issue? Right? Why does Shmuel say Beis Din doesn't get involved? In other words, it actually sounds pretty intuitive that Beis Din should get involved. Why wouldn't Beis Din get involved? So look at Rashi, it's actually quite interesting. Because we'll say in general, Shmuel is concerned about the possibility of two things. It will say one possibility is like this. Maybe before he left, the husband left his wife a bag of money. Right? Sarah Atbisa. Maybe he left her money. In other words, he's overseas. All right, he's going overseas. He leaves her a bag of money. He says, here, I'm going to be gone for a while. Here's what you need to support yourself. Meanwhile, she's going to show up in Beis Din. She's going to claim she has no money from mazonos. He's not here to contradict the claim. No one knows about the money. So therefore, I both say, if ultimately, again, let me add in one more piece. Furthermore, the second possibility is that maybe before he left, he said to her, you know what? Reuven's married to Rachel. He's going overseas. Reuven says to Rachel, you have a good job. You have a good job. You know what? Don't give your earnings to me. You keep your earnings and you support yourself. So I'll say, so going back for just a moment, the reason why Shmuel says Beis Din doesn't get involved is because Shmuel's concerned for one of those two possibilities. Maybe that's it. Maybe before he left, either he went ahead and he said, here's a bag of money, right? Or he said to her, keep your earnings. And the problem is she shows up in Beis Din saying, I have no mizonos. And meanwhile, we have no way of verifying her claim or what's happened or not. That's why Shmuel says in general, halacha l'maisa, we're not going to go ahead and get involved with mizonos. However, when we hear that he died, then we can get involved in mizonos. Why? Now look at that Rashi again. The poskin. Because what should we be concerned about? I will say, if we're concerned that maybe what? He left her a bag of money, so that's not a problem. Why? Because we'll say anyway later on, if he's dead and she's going to want to collect her shavua, she's going to have to swear that he didn't leave her anything. So the shavua will take care of that. Okay. And if we're concerned, and if we're concerned that maybe he said to her, keep your earnings, if he's dead, he doesn't have the claim against her earnings anyway. Right? So Lemaisa, again, Shmuel comes along and says that in a situation where we heard that, or the Gemara says, in a situation where we heard that he died, then under those circumstances, halacha lemaisa, everyone agrees that the Beis Din can get involved and provide her with mizonos. So keep ligi. Where does the machlokis come up? Where ultimately, again, we didn't hear that he died. Rav Amra Poskin. So let's take a step back. Right? So now, the way we started, the progression was, Reuven's married to Rachel. Reuven goes overseas. Rachel comes to Beis and says, I have no mizonos. So what do? Machlokes. Rav says, Beis Din sells off property in order to give her mizonos. Shmuel says, we don't get involved. So first qualification, Shmuel says, hold up. Even Rav agrees that Beis Din doesn't get involved when? First 3 months. Why? A person doesn't leave his home destitute. Good. Now the Gemara says, by the way, a further qualification is, if we're talking about a case where Reuven went overseas and now what? We heard that Reuven died. Everyone agrees that's why. And I'm sorry, let's take a step back. And why does Shmuel hold that Beis Din doesn't get involved? Why does all the Beis Din doesn't get involved? Because Shmuel will have to be concerned for one or two possibilities. Either A, he left her a bag of money, or B, husband said to her, keep your earnings. Keep your earnings. And because we don't know, therefore we can't start selling off his property. Okay, further qualification. We're talking about over here, the machlokes Rav and Shmuel is when we didn't hear that he's dead. We just heard that he's overseas. But if we heard that he's dead, in that case, then what? Everyone agrees Beis Din sells off property for her mizonos. Because in that case, we have no concerns. Shmuel has no concerns. We don't have to be concerned about that he left her a bag of money. Why? Because if that did occur, she's going to have to swear about that anyway when she collects her ksuva. And if it was a case where he said to her, keep your earnings, well, once he's dead, he's no longer entitled to earnings. Beautiful. So we'll say, so watch this. So therefore, if we know that he's dead, so the machlokes is only when what? Reuven's overseas and we have not heard that he's dead. Rav Amra Poskin, Tahamashubadla. So therefore, Rav says, now Reuven goes overseas. All we know is that he's overseas. Rachel shows up in Beis Din and says, I have no mizonos. Rav says, sell off his property. Why? Tahamashubadla. Because again, he's obligated to provide her with mizonos. Shmuel says, in Poskin, no, we don't start selling off property. My timer. So we'll say, why not? Here we go. Rav Zivid Amar Eimot Sari At Pisa. So Rav Zivid says, according to Shmuel, we're concerned that maybe he left her a bag of money. So she has money, but she's showing up in Beis Din. She's claiming, I have nothing. He's not here to defend the fact that he gave her money. So therefore, we can't start selling off property. Rav Papa says, Chayshinan Shema Amrullah Si'i Ma'aseyadech Bimzonosech. Rav Papa says we have to be concerned that maybe he said to her, keep your earnings. And therefore she has enough money to sustain herself. So we'll say, my benai. What's the practical difference between Rav Papa and Rav Zvid? Ike benaihu gidola v'lo sapka. So we'll say, so one afkamini would be a gidola who doesn't make enough money to support herself. So we'll say, if it's an issue of keeping your earnings, well, that's not sufficient here. But it's possible that what? That he deposited with her a bag of money. Inami kitana v'sapka. The other possibility is she's a kitana, but she does make enough money. So she makes enough money to support herself. That's one possibility. But a man would never entrust a bag of money with a katana. Because that's an afkamina. So Rabbosai, where we're holding right now is halacha l'maisa. The machlokes Rav and Shmuel is only in a case where Reuven is going overseas or is overseas. We haven't heard that he's dead. As far as we know, he's alive and well. Rachel shows up in Beis Din. I have no mazonos. Rav says Beis Din's going to start selling off Reuven's property. Shmuel says absolutely not. Absolutely not. We have to be concerned either he left her a bag of money or he told her to keep your earnings. But either way, we can't start selling off property without some clarity about the information. However, if Reuven went overseas and what? We hear that he died. In that case, everyone agrees that Beis Din could sell off property for mazonos. Rav, because the estate is obligated to support her. Shmuel, because again, the concerns fall off. If it's about her earnings, right? If he said to her, keep your earnings, then Lamaisa, again, her earnings aren't meshubed to him or to the estate once he's dead. And B, if it's about a bag of money, she's going to have to swear about that anyway when it comes to Kesuva collection. Good. So the Gemara says, let's go. Tanan, Mishal, Sayam, man went overseas, what says our Mishnah? The Ishto Tova'as Mazonos, and his wife comes to Beis Din and claims Mazonos. Right, I don't have any Mazonos. Chanan Omer Tishava. We'll say this is our Mishnah. Chanan says Tishava Basof velo Tishava Betchila. She only has to take a shivua. Basof. Basof means what? When she collects her ksuva, but does not require a shivua to collect mazonos. Nechleku alav b'nei kohanim gidolim. So the sons of the kohanim gidolim disagreed with Hanan, and they said va'amru tishava betchila ubasof. No, she has to take an oath before she collects mazonos and before she collects ksuva. So Rabbi say, watch this. Ad kan lo pligi el inyan shivua. The machlokes of us over here is only what? Regarding whether or not she has to swear before collecting mazonos. However, aval mezone yahavina la. I will say everyone agrees that's what? When she shows up in Beis Din and she says, I have no mazonos, that's what's going to happen. Beis Din is going to give her mazonos. Okay, this is machlokes. Does she have to swear or not before getting it? But everyone agrees that Beis Din is going to give it to her. So I will say, who does this contradict? This contradicts the position of Shmuel, right? Because Shmuel said that halacha l'maisa, if a woman shows up in Beis Din and says, my husband went overseas and he did not give me mazonos, that we do, Beis Din doesn't sell off property. You see from here that Beis Din does sell off property. Because the Gemara will say, you hear what the Gemara is doing? The machlokes in our Mishnah is only regarding whether or not she has to take a shvua before she gets the mazonos. But everyone is agreeing that she gets the mazonos. So this contradicts Shmuel, because here he's overseas, right? Pashtos, we haven't heard anything about him dying, and we're still going to give him. So Twitch, the Gemara says, Tirgam Shmuel, B'Shisham B'Shemes. No. Shmuel says our Mishnah is talking about what kind of case, where again I will say Reuven went overseas, and now we hear that he died. Oh, okay. So we hear that he died. Remember, even Shmuel agrees in that case that halacha l'maisa, we're going to give her mazonos. We're going to give him mazonos. So we'll say, it's good. Tashma. So we'll say again, another question. Tashma. Mishalach Medinas Hayam. Someone went overseas. Okay. So, I'm sorry. Mishalach Medinas Hayam. Someone went overseas. Reuven went overseas. And what happens? V'ishto tavas mazonos. And now his wife comes to Beis Din, and she is claiming mazonos. So, B'nei Kohanim Gedolim Omrim. So ultimately, again, the B'nei Kohanim Gedolim say, so make her the omrim tishava, that she has to swear. Chanan says lo tishava, she doesn't have to swear. Ve'im ba va'amar pasakti la mazonos ne'eman. Now, both say if the husband comes back and he says, 1 second, I went ahead and I left her mazonos, then ultimately again he is believed. So both say we'll get into that. We'll get into what that second part means. But Lamaisa, once again, what do you see in this case? That she's showing up in Beis Din, and she's claiming, I have no mazonos. What do we do with her when she claims I have no mazonos? What do we do with her? We give her mazonos. So both say this supports Rav, contradicts Shmuel, to which the Gemara says Shmuel would also say, Hachanami b'sheshama bo shemes. No. This is same case. This is where we heard that he died. That's why I give him mazonos. The Gemara says, we heard that he died. The second part of the Mishnah is v'im ba, v'ha'im ba. He came back. Right? I will say. It's the wrong religion for that, right? So Maisa again, right? We heard that he came back, right? See, he's back. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, listen to this. Va'im ba kamar, so the Gemara says, va'amar. So im ba la'achar shmua. So what it's talking about is there was a rumor that he died, and now he came, or not a rumor. In other words, we heard that he died, and then he came back. So obviously the rumor is false. Obviously, but for our purposes, the point over here is when the Mishnah says that we're dispersing mazonos to her, we're setting up all of these cases as we heard that he was dead. So again, I want to point out, just understand what's happening over here. We're bringing all of these cases as a potential contradiction to Shmuel, and the Gemara is simply reinterpreting all of these cases as situations where we heard that he was dead. That's why we're dispersing mazonos. Okay, Tashma was another attempt to go and refute Shmuel. Mishal Medinas Hayam. Someone goes overseas. V'ishto tovas mazonos. Right, Reuben goes overseas, and Rachel's claiming mazonos. So what happens? Ishto tovas mazonos. Imba v'amar tzima seyadech mazonosech. Rashai. So we'll say if he comes along and says, husband comes back and says, "Listen, I told you to keep your earnings. Okay, so remember again, that is a permitted approach. Kadmu Beis Din upasku. If while he was absent, Beis Din came along and stipulated, right? They came along and they sold off property. Upasku, masha pasku. Whatever they did, they did. So again, once again, it's all the same thing. What do you see over here? That a woman's showing up in Beis Din, right? And she's claiming, I have no mazonos. What is Beis Din doing when she makes the claim, I have no mazonos? They're selling off property. This seems to support Rav and contradict Shmuel. To which the Gemara says, Hachanami b'sheshama bo shemes. Okay, so we're giving the same answer, right? These are all cases where we heard, Beis Din heard the husband was dead. That's why I will say, remember again, and in that case, even according to Shmuel, if you heard the husband is dead, halacha l'maisa, you can sell that property. Tashma, another approach. So we'll say somebody went overseas, and ultimately again, the wife's coming to Beis Din, claiming I have no mazonos. Beis Din yardim l'nechasav, v'zanin umefarnesin leishto, avalo banav ubenosav v'lo davar acher. So we'll say, so again, same case, Reuben's married to Rachel, Reuben goes overseas, Rachel comes to Beis Din. Rachel says, I have no mazonos. Beis Din says, okay. Beis Din starts selling off his property in order to go ahead and support the wife. But however, we won't sell off property to support the children, and we won't sell off property for davar acher, for something else. Shabbos says, so what's the case? Once again, this seems to support Rav, contradict Shmuel. That's whenever a woman shows up in Beis Din and says, I have no mazonos, Beis Din will go ahead and sell off the property. To which the Gemara says, no. Amar Rav Sheshes. What's the case? Shabbos says, second wide line on Kuf Zayin Aleph. B'mashres ishto ayidei shlish. Very interesting. We're talking about a case over here of a man, of Ruvain, who even before he went overseas was supporting his wife through a third party. Look at Rashi. B'mashre ishto ayidei shlish. Hamid apetropis lezona. So we're talking about a case where a husband went ahead and established a third party, an apotropis, to support his wife. So we'll say, so now what's happened? So husband, whatever the reason, husband is supporting his wife through a third party. Now husband goes overseas. She's showing up in Beis Din saying, I have no mazonos. Why? What happened? Apotropis quit. He quit. Now I will say, in the case of an apotropis, Rashi says over here, so we'll say, in this case over here, remember, because she was already being supported by a third party, there's no concern that what? That either A, he went ahead and said to her, keep your earnings, right? Or that he gave her a bag of money. Why not? Because since there was already an established mechanism for her support, there's no concern that he bypassed the established framework and did something else. So in a case like this, even Shmuel would agree there's nothing to be concerned about, that maybe, again, she received the money, she received the bag of money, or she was told to keep her earnings, and therefore, halacha l'maisa, Beis Din will get involved and sell off property. Incredible. So Moshe says, if that's the case, ihachi banav nosav nami. So Moshe says, I don't understand, so why wouldn't the same thing apply then to the kids? In other words, The Mishnah says that we'll sell off property to support the wife, but not to support the kids. But if everyone's being supported by an apotropos, then why not go ahead and sell off property for everyone? To which the Gemara says, we're talking about a case ultimately again where you're supporting the wife through an apotropos but not the kids. My pascha, why would you establish it that way? Oh, I will say, you know what this case is incredible. This is a case of where Reuven went overseas. We heard that he died, but we only have an eid echad that tells us that he died. So watch this. So the Gemara says, watch this. The ibais in sube masi min saba, because she, Rachel, since she could get remarried through the eidos of an eid echad, mizoni nami yavin Allah, will give her mizonos based on the eid echad as well. But the kids, the testimony of the eid echad doesn't really do anything for the kids, because Lamaisa, they would not be permitted to take possession of the estate through the testimony of the eid echad. Therefore, because testimony of the eid echad does not give them the right to the estate, it also doesn't give them the right to mizonos. Incredible. So we'll say the point is, once again, this Mishnah cannot be used as a proof to Shmuel. Cannot be used as a proof to Rav, a proof against Shmuel. Why? Because once again, we're setting it up as what? We heard that he died. By the way, my davar achar. We had this again before. I will say. Right? Remember again, this Mishnah that we just learned says that Allah Lamaisa, Reuven's overseas. Rachel shows up in Beis Din. She says, I have no mazonos. Beis Din will sell off property to sustain her, but not for davar acher. Tushmer says, what does it mean davar acher? Rav Chisda Amar, sorry. My davar acher, Rav Chisda Amar tachshit. Rav Chisda says it means jewelry or adornments, accessories. Rav Yosef Amar tzedakah. Rav Yosef says it means for tzedakah, to give her money, to give tzedakah. Man damar tachshit. So the one who says that you can't sell off property for tachshit, kol shekain tzedakah, Amud Beis will say all the more so. You can't sell off property for tzedakah. Man damer tzedakah, but the one who says tzedakah about tachshit yahavin Allah. But tachshit we will give her. Why? Because a man does not want his wife to not be fully adorned, right? Tinava literally means to become repulsive or ugly. The idea is that we assume that a husband would go ahead and leave sufficient funds or allow for sufficient funds for his wife to have perfume, for his wife to have accessories. Incredible. Good. Tashma. So we'll say, here we go. We'll say, we're still in the same theme over here. Remember, we have our Machlokes Rav and Shmuel. Right? Woman shows up in Beis Din. Rachel shows up in Beis Din. Reuven's overseas. I have no mazonos. Does Beis Din sell off property? Rav, yes. Shmuel, no. However, everyone agrees in what? In a case where halacha l'maisa, we heard that Reuven died, even Shmuel will agree in that case that halacha l'maisa will sell off property. So just bringing a whole bunch of cases that appear to pose a contradiction to the position of Shmuel. So Tashma, Hayivama Gimel Chadash Marishon Mizonis Mishal Baila was actually an interesting case. A Yivama, so we'll say, so this is right. Rachel is married to Reuven. Reuven dies without children. Reuven has a brother Shimon. So now we'll say, here's what's interesting. Remember, they don't do Yibum, right? Let's say again, for the first 3 months, she's not doing Yibum. Why is she not doing Yibum for the first 3 months? Havchana, right? So it's actually interesting. I don't remember doing this in Yavam. Yeah, it is in Yavam. It's Daf Mem Aleph, right? So interesting. So she doesn't do Yibum for the first 3 months after the death of her husband. So the Shaila now becomes, right? So the Shaila now becomes, who supports her during that time? So Hayivama Gimel Chadash Marishon Nizonos Mishal Baila. For the first 3 months that she can't do Yibum, so she is supported from her deceased husband's estate. Mikan ve'elech. After that, Einon Nizonos Lo Mishal Baila V'Lo Mishal Yavham. Right, so we'll say after that she's not supported by anyone. Right? She's not supported by her husband's estate, and she's not supported by the Yavam. However, Amad Bedin. Let's say again now, we'll say the Yavama comes to Beis Din and she says, "Come on." Right, either do Yibum or do Chalitza, which we'll say could occur right after the first 3 months. She shows up in Beis Din, says Shimon, whatever you want to do, but just do it now. Ubarach. I will say what happens. Shimon runs away. Right, conveniently at a business trip. Right, he had a trade show in Vegas. Everyone has a trade show in Vegas, right? The only thing that does is only Rabbanim don't have conventions in Vegas. Everything else happens incredible. So what happens? Amad Bedinu Barach. So what's talacha? Nizonos Michel Yavam. So we'll say in that case, she is supported by the Yavams from the Yavam. So we'll say, once again, now this is not the same exact case, but it's close enough. But what do you see from here? So this is a case of a woman showing up in Beis Din saying, I have no mazonos, and what is Beis Din going to do? In this case, okay, it's the Yavam, but Beis Din is going to go into Shimon's estate, sell off property in order to support the Yavama. So we'll say this seems to contradict Shmuel and support Rav. So we'll say, so Shmuel says, of course, but this is not a fair case. Shmuel says, I'll tell you why this works. What do you have to be concerned about? Right? So the Gemara says, lahai, imushum tsurari, lo mekaver daiti lagabar. Well, so what do you have to be concerned about? That the Yavam gave her a bag of money before he ran away? No, that's not going to happen over here, because they're going to both say they're not married. They're not married. There's no connection there. Imushum maisi adel, and if it's about the fact that, maybe what? That her husband said that her earnings should be to her husband's dead, and the earnings aren't meshubed once the husband's dead anyway. So if Rabbi Shmuel just says, by the way, this is an outlier case. This is a different kind of case. It's not an outlier case. Shmuel will say this is a case where even I agree that Allah Chalamaisa, Beis Din should sell off property in order to support the Yavama. So Tashma, Ha'isha Shahalchi Ubailam Dinasayam, a woman goes overseas with her husband, Ubasa Va'amra Meis Baili. So we'll say, interesting. She comes back from vacation. He doesn't, right? So she says, my husband died. Meis Baili. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Ratza Sanizonas, Ratza Sagova Kesuvos. So we'll say, in that case, she's believed, right? She is believed, and now she has a choice. What's her choice? Her choice is collect mizonos from the estate or collect ksuva. Those are her choices. Remember again, but once she collects ksuva, then obviously, again, mizonos is done. Fine, so that's her choice. However, we'll say, what happens if she comes back from vacation alone, and she says, Gershani Baili, my husband divorced me. Vacation didn't go well, right? My husband divorced me. So what's talacha? Misparneses v'oleches ad kidei ksuvasa. So we'll say, in that case, we'll go ahead and we'll support her up to the amount of her ksuva. Because we'll say the truth is, like, it's no skin off our back. In other words, that lemaisa, regardless, she's entitled to a certain amount of money. So if she would rather take that money in the form of mizonos, right, and not a ksuva payout, that's fine. That's fine. In other words, we're not concerned about her defrauding the estate or her husband. So we'll say, but point over here is what? She's showing up. She's saying, my husband divorced me, or my husband's back, right? Essentially what she's saying is, my husband is back still overseas. I have no mizonos. Beis Din gets involved. To which the Gemara once again says, Hachanami kisheshama bo shemes. We're talking about a case where we heard that he died. Okay. Umayshna ad k'dei ksuvasa. So I'll say, if that's the case, then why ultimately again is mizonos limited to the amount of the ksuva? So the Gemara says, Di'ihi da'afsida nafsha. Because ultimately, again, she's the one who's causing herself to lose out because she's coming back and claiming that she's a grusha, and a grusha ultimately again is not entitled to mizonos. Good. Tashma. So we'll say, so once again, we're still left with machlokas Rav and Shmuel. It's still all the same machlokas. So Tashma, Keitzad Amru Mima Enes Ein Lo Mizonos. So we'll say, what's the case? What's the case where we say Mima Enes? And we'll say, and I remember again, who's the Mima Enes? Remember, Midaraisa, father has the ability to marry off his minor daughter. Midrabanan, a mother and a brother have that same right as well. However, if a mother and a brother marry off the minor girl, then what? It's only Kiddushay Dirabanan. Because Kiddushay Dirabanan, how does the girl, while she's a minor, dissolve the marriage? Miyun. Simple refusal. So, Keitzad Amru Mima Enes Ein Lo Mizonos. What's the case where we say that a Mima Enes doesn't have Mizonos? It can't be in a case where she's living with her husband, right? Because if she's living with her husband, then her husband is chayv mizonos. Oh, rather, it must be what case? Where her husband went overseas, right? So Reuven is married to Rachel. In this case, Rachel is a kitana. Reuven went overseas. Love Sava Achla. She borrowed money to sustain herself. Amda umiyana. Then what happens? She decided to do miyun. So both say that's the case. That's the case where you say that a mima enes doesn't have mizonos. So taima de miyana. Now the reason she doesn't have mizonos is because she did miyun. Ha lo miyana. But if she didn't do miyun, yavin Allah, we would give her mizonos. So we'll say, what do you see from here? That if her husband is overseas and Rachel, the Ketana, comes to Beis Din and says, I have no mizonos, what would Beis Din do? they would intervene, sell off property, and give him mizonos. This contradicts Shmuel, supports Rav. Shmuel, no. Again, Shmuel said, yes, I'll agree with you that in this case they'll sell off property to give him mizonos. Why? Because we don't have the same concerns in this case. What should we be concerned about? If we have to be concerned about that the husband maybe gave her a bag of money before he left, that concern doesn't apply here. Why not? Why not? A man's not giving a bag of money to a kitana. And ultimately, again, the kitana lo sapka. And if it's about her, that maybe he said to her, keep your earnings, in general, kitana doesn't make enough money to support herself. So Shmuel will say, even I will agree in this case that halacha lamaisa, when she comes to Beis Din could sell off his property in order to support her. To which the Gemara says, okay, good. My havi Allah. What's the conclusion? Right? So we'll say, so we are left with a fundamental machlokes, Rav and Shmuel. Reuven is married to Rachel, right? Reuven goes overseas. Rachel comes to Beis Din claiming, I have no mazonos. So what do we do in such a situation? Rav says, sell off property. Shmuel says, don't sell off property. Why does Shmuel say don't sell off property? We have to be concerned. Maybe he left her a bag of money. Maybe he told her to keep her earnings. However, everyone seems to agree that in a case where what? Reuven went overseas and then what? We hear that Reuven died. In that case, everyone agrees that what? That Allah Chalamais, the Beis Din will sell off property for mizonos. So bottom line, so in a case where we didn't hear that the husband died, what is the halacha? Who does the halacha follow? Rav or Shmuel? So here we go. So the Gemara says, "My havi Allah, kiyas Rav Dimi Amar, my sebalaf Rebbe Beis Sharm." One time, an episode, right? Something happened. This kind of case came up in front of Rebbe in Beis Sharim. By the way, remember we just had this on Yom Tiv. Rebbe was buried in Beis Sharim. Rebbe lived and died in Beis Sharim. Remember again. But Rebbe, we find Rebbe in Tzipori. When did Rebbe go to Tzipori? When did he go to Tzipori? When he was sick. Why did he go to Tzipori when he was sick? Mali Avir, the air is good. The air is good in Tzipori. So both say, so listen to this. So one time, a case like this happened, came before Rebbe in Beis Sharim, upasek la mizonos. A case like this, where husband went overseas, and we Rebbe paskin, that Allah Chalamai the Beis Din could go and give him mizonos. But the same case became a part of Rabbi Shmuel and Tzipori, below pasuk la mizonos, and he did not allow Beis Din did not sell off property from mizonos. So we'll say it sounds like that ultimately Rebbe's passing like Rav and Rabbi Shmuel's passing like Shmuel. So Rabbi Yochanan wondered about this. Why didn't Rabbi Shmuel give her mizonos? Even if you look at our Mishnah only recorded a machlokes regarding whether or not she has to take a shvua before getting mizonos. Aval mizoni ya'avinala. But according to our Mishnah, everyone seems to agree that what? That in fact we do give her mizonos. Amrali Rav Shman bar Abba kvar tirgama Rabbeinu Shmuel beBavel kisheshamu bo shemes. That was talking about a case of say where what? Our Mishnah was talking about a case where what? Where we heard that he died. That's where everyone agrees. If we heard that he died, that we're going to give her mizonos. The only machlokes is, does she require a shavua or not? Amrle, pasirasu ba kulihai. Have you answered up everything with this? Ki asa rabin amr maise ba lifnei Rebbe beBeis Sharim v'lo pasek la mizonos. An episode like this came up for Rebbe in Beis Sharim, and he did not award her mizonos. Lifnei Rabbi Shmuel b'tzipori upasek la mizonos. Rabbi Shmuel paskin, she would get mizonos in a case like this where husband was overseas. Rabbi Yochanan. Why did Rebbe not award her mizonos? The halo nechlaku chanan ubnei kanim gidolim el le'inyan shvua aval mizonos yavinala. Once again, we'll say we're just going through the same thing, right? Even our Mishnah only had a machlokes about whether or not she has to take a shvua before collecting mizonos. But everyone seems to agree that halacha lamaisa she gets the mizonos. Amar Rav Shman bar Abba about Tirgam Shmuel beBavel kisheshamu bo shemes. It was a case where we heard ultimately again that the husband died. That's why in that case, even Shmuel agrees that we award her Amrullah pasirasa kulehai. So I'll say, how do we paskin? V'hilchasa kavase derav uposkin mizonos le'eshes ish. Rabbi says the Gemara halacha l'maisa we paskin like Rav, and in a case where a woman shows up in Beis Din and she says, Rachel shows up in Beis Din, she says, my husband Reuven went overseas and I have no mizonos. What's the halacha? ultimately, again, we award her mizona. So I'll say, before we finish off, I know I have a yitzhar to finish to the Mishnah, but I first just want to give you this halacha l'maisa. So I'll say, here it is. Rambam, Hilchos Ishos, Parak Yud Beis, halacha tes zayin. Misha halach l'medina acheres, ubo ishto litboa mizonos. Reuven is married to Rachel. Reuven goes overseas. Rachel comes to Beis and she says, I have no mizonos. What's the halacha? Well, we'll say, watch this. Shlosha chadashim rishonim b'yom halichaso ein poskin lamizonos. Shechazaka she'ein adam aniach beiso rekan. Let's see, here we go. The Gemara says, first 3 months from the time that Reuven left, we're not selling off any property. Why not? We make the assumption that a person doesn't leave his house empty. Right? So we assume that for the first 3 months, she's going to have what she needs in the house. However, mikan ve'elech poskin la mizonos. After 3 months, ultimately, again, we award her mizonos. Doesn't mean we award her mizonos. It means if there's property, Beis Din sells it off. And I will say, we don't get into any calculations with her. What if Rachel works? So she has earnings. Beis Din doesn't get involved in that. We could settle that up when the husband comes back. We could settle that up afterwards. But I will say, we paskin like Rav, but with Shmuel's qualification. So I'll say, even if we don't hear that he died, right? We hear that he's alive and well, right? Lamaisa, if she comes to Beis Din saying, I have no mazonos, Beis Din, not for the first 3 months, we assume she has what she needs in the home, but after 3 months, Beis Din will award her mazonos and even begin to go out and sell off property. The Rambam then also brings down, even if she sold off property herself, halacha lamaisa, that works. Good. So we'll say, that's why we pass halacha lamaisa like Rav. The Hilchasa, both say let's just finish up. The Hilchasa kavase drafuna, dam Ravuna, I'm sorry. The Hilchasa kavase drafuna, Amarav, dam Ravuna, Amarav, Yechola isha shetomer lebayla, any mizonos veinosa. So we'll say, once we're getting into this, we're just going to belt out some halacha lemaisa over here. So we'll say, first halacha follows Rav. Number 2, halacha follows Rav Huna, name of Rav, who says that what a woman could say to her husband, any mizonos veinosa, which means a woman could say, I'm keeping my earnings. Let's say Rachel has a good job, right? She earns a lot of money. She doesn't want to give over her earnings to her husband, so she could forego the right of mezonos and keep her earnings. And lastly, I will say, the Hilchasa Kavase Rav Zvid B'kunya. And the halacha of Rav Zvid B'kunya, both say, clay kunya is an interesting case. Clay kunya is an earthenware utensil that is covered by metal. So both say there's an interesting shaila in Maseches Avodah Zarah when it comes to a clay kunya. How do we look at such a utensil? Do we look at it as a metallic utensil or as an earthenware utensil? I will say, who cares? It's a big difference. Why? Tumah will say, and even blios, absorptions. Remember, metallic utensils absorb but can be purged. Earthenware utensils absorb but cannot be purged. So what do you do with the kunya? So the Amar of Zvid, hai mani de kunya. These earthenware vessels coated with metal, chiyuri ve'uchmi, if it's white metal or black metal, sharu. Ultimately, they're permitted. I will say, permitted means that we assume it's only the metallic part that absorbs, but the absorptions do not seep into the earthenware utensil. Yaroki, however, the greenish hue metal, asiri, because we assume that those are more porous and therefore allow for the earthenware utensil, the earthenware part, to absorb as well. And we'll say furthermore, furthermore, even with the white and black, the only time we assume that the earthenware part of the utensil doesn't absorb, but only the metallic part does, that's only if there aren't cracks. Aval ispahu kartafuni asiri. But lamaisa, ultimately again, if there are cracks, then even the earthenware utensil is assumed to go ahead and absorb as well. I'll say a really incredible idea. I'll just point out something interesting. Man is often compared to a kli charas, often compared to an earthenware utensil. And the truth is, for a variety of reasons, on a most basic level, right? May offer atavel, offer tashuv, right? Earthenware comes from the earth. So too we come from the earth, we go back to the earth. Very apropos for Parshas Bereshis. They will say also earthenware is very easily breakable. So too man, unfortunately, could break himself very easily. Other piece about why we're compared to earthenware is that earthenware absorbs, and often you can't get out once it absorbs. You know, say sometimes in life we do things, we make decisions, and the things we do often can't be undone. It's an incredibly important idea. But you see something interesting, which is when earthenware is covered with metal, when earthenware is covered with metal, so ultimately it affords the earthenware a certain level of protection. It affords the earthenware a certain level of shmira, right? So the absorptions don't get in. They both say, so what's the metal? What's the metal? The metal is Torah. The metal is tefillah. The metal is ruchnius. You see, if you take your kli and you surround it with a protective barrier, you put a mechitza around it, you protect it with your own avoda, then the absorptions still come in, but they don't go into the earthenware. They go into the metal. And if they go into the metal, they're there, but they can be extracted, they can be undone. How important it is in life to make the protective mechitzas, to make the protective metal around our kli. So that way, when we make bad decisions, which inevitably we will, and we have bad absorptions, which inevitably we will, we're not down and out. It's not stuck in there forever. It comes in, but again, if there's a proper mechitza, a proper protective barrier of ruchnius, the same way it came in, it can also be extracted as well. I want to say, shkoyach, shkoyach. Good way to end the week. All right, Chevron Zoom. Everyone have a great day. Jerry, Dr. Lossman, Chevron from Eretz Yisrael, have a great day.